Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Brett. As you introduced, I'm Michael Burns. I'm the research officer at the Northern Ireland War Memorial. And today I'm going to talk a bit about Armagh and the Second World War. So, oral history at the Northern Ireland War Memorial. I'm the research officer and I look after our large oral history collection. And we've got over 350 recordings. It all started in 2007 when we were approached by a retiring history teacher, Una Walls from Newcastle. She wanted something to do in her spare time, and so she decided she would go around sort of old people's homes in the Kilkeel, Newcastle areas and interview them about their wartime memories. In 2016 then, we felt it was time for us to have our own oral history project, so we launched the Belfast Blitz project. So that marked the 75th anniversary of the Belfast Blitz. The following year, we launched the US 75 project, so that marked the 75th anniversary of the US entry into the war. And the year after, we widened it out. We started the War and Me project, so that was in 2018. And as you can see, we've been up and down all across the country, interviewing people in every county, every constituency, trying to capture what the war was like for them, what their experiences were like, and how they differed across the country. So I started at the beginning, at outbreak, the 3rd of September 1939, when a lot of the people we interviewed, they were obviously children at the time, they remember tuning in and listening to Neville Chamberlain's broadcast, which went,
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
And obviously, you can imagine what those people might have felt tuning in and listening that the war was on, particularly because a lot of their parents, a lot of their grandparents reacted to the news because they remembered the First World War and what had happened and the horrors and the people that they had lost locally. So these are just two locals that we have interviewed. So this Frida Muldrew at the top, she grew up in Market Hill, and she remembers on her way home from church being stopped by a young man in the Avenue Joey McStay who told her that the war was on. Similarly, Derek Walker in Portadown, he was actually in the service, and he remembers the caretaker walked up during the service and gave a piece of paper to the minister in the pulpit. He looked at it and told everyone gathered that the war was on. So you can sort of imagine what it would have been like to hear that announcement and sort of the trepidation that they would have had knowing that the war was coming. A lot of people obviously tuned in and listened to Neville Chamberlain's broadcast, and a lot of them talk about the wireless and how important that was. A lot of people we interviewed, they were children, and so it was their job to make sure that the wireless never ran out of charge. They usually had a dry battery and a wet battery, and the wet battery had to be recharged, and so it was often given to the child who took it down to the local garage and they charged it up. They left it in and they picked up another one, so they were never without a wireless within the house. Obviously, it was an important informational tool, but there was also a big entertainment aspect. So people remember listening to speeches, George VI, Churchill, then Princess Elizabeth. Entertainment, Itma, It's That Man Again, Tommy Handley, Workers' Playtime, Dick Barton, Special Agent, a lot of radio plays that some still not going today, like the Archers. And music that we still listen to today, those wartime classics, Vera Lynn, the Andrews Sisters, Flanagan and Allen. But it could also be used for propaganda, both by the British and by the Germans. And a lot of people remember tuning in and listening to this man here, William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw, who always began his broadcasts.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Germany calling, Germany calling. And a lot of the kids remember listening to this, and they didn't really take him very seriously. They thought it was a bit of a joke. But we do have different people that we've interviewed who remember Lord Haw Haw mentioning places locally. So there was one story I was told about how on the radio, Lord Haw Haw announced the time that the Lisburn Town Hall clock had stopped at. So, I mean, that seems fairly innocuous, but what that was, obviously the clock had stopped and they had some information had been passed to the Germans, and Lord Haw was able to announce on the radio that that had happened, and what just to show that they had that sort of spy network in Northern Ireland. And we do know spies did operate in the north. Obviously, with war being announced, wartime prep began immediately, and the Home Guard and ARP were formed. The ARP, the Area Precautions, and they were civil defence, so they were sort of the last line of defence in case of German invasion. So people often describe hearing or seeing the Home Guard out manoeuvring in the field and training. ARP wardens, they used to maintain the blackout. You used to always hear them. You see them on things like Dad's Army, the wardens going round, knocking, making sure that the lights were all kept out. Kids were, everyone was all issued with a gas mask. This is a children's gas mask. It was known as a Mickey Mouse gas mask because of its bright colours. So it's red and blue. I don't think it makes it look any less horrifying. But apparently they were very claustrophobic to have on. This is Brian Hall. He grew up in Belfast, but he was evacuated to Armagh in County Armagh, and he remembers having the gas mask on him.
You went to school with this thing draped around your neck, and you were given drills in the classroom and putting them on. I can very clearly remember the feeling of the rubber bands over the top of your head, around your ears, and the mask at the front with the perspex or whatever was plastic, which tended to steam up.
As I say, a lot of children remember having those on, having gas mask drills in school. And has anyone heard of a gas ban? There's no recognition. Well, what a gas van was, the authorities used to bring these vans round to schools, and they used to park them up, and all the children would put on their gas mask, and they would be led into this van where they would literally be gassed, with tear gas usually. This was to make sure that they were wearing their gas mask properly. We don't have any reports of injuries in Northern Ireland, but apparently because tear gas condenses on your clothes, in England, there's reports of the kids all going back to class, taking off their gas mask, and then all start crying because the gas was still on them. Air raid shelters were constructed, although not enough for the population of Belfast. Does anyone recognise what this is? That's City Hall. So this was in September 1938, so actually a full year before the war was announced. You can see them here building sandbags, and then with a corrugated iron roof. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't like to be in one of those in an air raid. I don't think it would keep you very safe. Blackout and barrage balloons. This is Brian Hall again, and he remembers the barrage balloons being floated up across Belfast.
The material of the balloon was not like a large balloon filled and expanded to tension. It was floppy because they had to keep reviewing the gas inside it. And it looked like anything but impressive. It was like a tired elephant. But I can remember them being raised and lowered.
You can sort of understand why to a child a barrage balloon would look like a tired elephant, and that actually comes up quite a few times within our different oral history interviews. This is a photo taken from the bottom of Donegal Street, so you can see the barrage balloons all across. This is up North Belfast, and I've got a better view there. You can see the Cave Hill in the background. They were taken with Belfast Telegraph photos at the time. And can anyone tell me what that is? No, that's everyone. Everyone says it's a siren.
Is it for headlights?
That's exactly right. It's a headlight cover. So obviously during the blackout had to be maintained, but they also had to still go about their daily business. And so this was fitted to the front of cars, and it would only let very limited light out these three slits and then at the top. And that was obviously to maintain the blackout, but it was also incredibly dangerous. And we know that basically road deaths in Northern Ireland doubled overnight with the blackout being introduced. And you can imagine how dangerous that was, because if you're out in the dark, you won't see a car coming and you'll just walk out in front of it, and that's it. Brian Hall again, his memories of the blackout cover and blackout.
And apart from that, life went on as usual, except for the blackout. The blackout was very definitely a rigid thing because it was really tightly enforced, and in particular from motor vehicles, because all motor vehicles had baffles on the shields or masks on the headlights with a coil that put a very limited amount of light in the immediate front area of the space in front of the car, but cars would travel slowly at night, and it even extended, and I suppose especially extended to cycles, because the light, the lamp on the front of a bicycle also had a mask or a baffle shielding it, and they were also checked by police or ARP employees.
Again, we do have a story in the oral history collections of a man from Port Glenone, and he was coming from the cinema from Ballymena, and he was cycling down a hill, and he was cycling up the hill, and an American was cycling down the hill, and they collided in the middle of the road, and both went flying. And he broke his nose, and the American was slightly inebriated, and so he didn't. He wasn't injured at all. But they were sitting there in the middle of the road, and a car pulls up. It just happened to be the local doctor who's passing by, so he got them both in the car and took them into the town. And besides those things that we've talked about, the blackout and those sort of impact of the war, the first big thing that affected people in Northern Ireland was the rationing, which was introduced in January 1940. So there were ration books, and you had coupons, and you had to use them for all sorts of daily goods. And they kept introducing more and more goods to the ration. And the whole idea behind this was obviously to level the playing field, to make sure that everybody had the same access to the goods. However, in reality, it didn't really work the same. There were a couple of wartime specific foods. So a lot of people we talk about remember powdered or dried eggs. Has anyone ever had powdered eggs? Yes. Yeah. What did you think of them? They're all right. Well, about 50% of the people we interview say they're all right. They did the job. Another 50% have never eaten eggs in their life since, because that put them off. Has anyone ever had mock banana? You know what it is? What mock banana is, obviously you couldn't get bananas during the war. So what you did is you got parsnips, you boiled them up, you mashed them with something called banana essence. And apparently between two slices of bread, you could not tell the difference. I've never tried it myself. But yes, as I said, that rationing didn't actually really level the playing field, because the poorest in society still sometimes couldn't afford to spend their coupons to purchase the goods. They didn't have the money to spend on luxuries like sweets or sugar or meat. And so they would sell their coupons to better off families, even though it was entirely legal. Rationing also didn't really affect Northern Ireland as badly as it did across the water, because a lot of people had connections to the countryside, and so they would just hop on the bus, go and visit their cousins in Armagh and get eggs and milk and bring them back. And also obviously with the border down south. But I've got two examples here. So this event should need no introduction. Where we're standing, Roger Weatherup. So he was interviewed in 2018, and obviously he was a former curator of this institution. He grew up in Belfast, but he remembers rationing and going to the countryside to get eggs and butter.
Once the war came on, we were met with food rationing, we were met with restrictions of transport. Petrol was not allowed except to improve people and successful bank marketeers. And of course also, as part of the war effort, my father dug up a friend of the back garden and started growing his own vegetables. And he always liked doing that. The front garden firmly remained in roses, but the back garden had the addition of two large vegetable beds and a row of black currant bushes, which were all part of feed yourself. Yeah. Because of course rationing was quite severe, and many never noticed it in our case, because in many places in the country, when we were getting short of eggs or something, we just went back and paid them a visit. This was highly illegal, of course, and the danger of the bus coming back. And you had to sort of the bus, of course, not coming in your car anymore. The danger of coming back was as the police would stop and search the bus. So the answer was, when you got into your little box of eggs, you put it a long way away from you down the luggage rack. So the police sees it, they could see you with it.
There's lots of stories like that. And there was another man that I interviewed, I think he was from Lisburn, and he remembered being sent up the country to collect eggs, and the bus stopping and the customs men getting on, and suddenly everybody threw the eggs on the floor, and the police officer and the customs man got on, and just the eggs were all rolling about in front of them, and everyone denied any knowledge that they had anything to do with them. And obviously, with the border with neutral Ireland, people could smuggle goods, and there were shortages down south, such as tea. So people used to bring tea down, and they would have brought things back up. Butter, Hafner sausages, was a really popular one, which of course you can still get today. and material. So this is a story. This is my grandmother, Rita, and she was from Portadown. She lived in Portadown a long time, but she's actually from Tandragee, to get that right. And Rita remembers for her wedding in 1952, because rationing obviously went on until after the war. She remembers going down to get the material for her wedding dress.
Mrs. Stores in Portadown made my wedding dress and all these.
How did you get the material?
With my in the free state and smoke, but it was burners. I'm up the stairs in the shop, and I go to the once for mine and then go and get on weeds. They used to love it for breakfast in the shop. But when we got our messages done, we left it there till we come, to the train, and then they put it round with tape.
And honestly, the amount that smuggling appears within our oral history collection, it really is. Everybody did it. It was a necessity. And there's lots of funny stories. And a lot of people obviously would have went, like my grandmother, down by train, and particularly if they lived in the town that the train went through. And there was one man who I interviewed quite recently, he's now a man in his 90s, and he remembers going down to Dublin with his mother. And obviously he looked quite innocent. His mother told him to sit forward as they came into the station, and they put butter and sausages all behind him, behind them. The customs officer comes along, takes one look at him, tells him to stand up, sees all the butter and sausages and takes them off. Customs man goes on, checks the rest of the carriage. Train moves on. Of course, what the mother of the boy that I interviewed, she had hidden in the pull-up blind of the train carriage 2 nylon stockings. So she'd sort of put them in and then rolled up. So she didn't actually mind losing the butter and the sausages because she wanted the nylon stockings to get through. And there's lots of stories like that. In Gore Wood Station, which was the customs station on this side of the border, people used to hang out all their goods on strings on the wrong side of the train, because obviously if you're coming into a train, you can only access it from one side of the platform, until the customs officer got wise to this, and he would jump down onto the tracks with a big sack and a pair of scissors, and he would clip all the contraband goods into the sack. So there's tons and tons of stories. I could actually just do a talk all just about smuggling, but we'll move on. And that's my grandmother there during just a couple of years after the war. Soldiers, obviously there were many soldiers stationed in and around Armagh, and they were here in training and manoeuvres. British soldiers, American soldiers, Belgians, lots of different nationalities. So we need to remember who these photos are. So the first one is here. These are women serving team to the crew of a light tank Mark 6 of C Squadron, the 2nd Fife and Fofer Yeomanry, the Royal Armoured Corps at Bestbrook in Armagh on the 25th of March 1941. On the far side is the same day, and you can see the small boys all getting a ride on the tank in Bestbrook. And in the middle, we have the Duke of Abercorn inspecting a battalion of the 2nd Inniskilling Fusiliers at Armagh. So these are all Imperial War Museum photos that they have. But soldiers were stationed all around the country. Every town basically had some soldiers stationed in for training, and they would have taken over local church halls, any sort of requisition, any of the big houses, and put nissen huts and tents in those places. You can imagine the effect that would have on the locals. And a lot of people we interview obviously remember dances, going to the cinema, and they would have interacted with these soldiers. And so I wanted to get an example of a family that married a soldier. I didn't actually have to look very far, because my granny was the youngest of 7 daughters, and 3 of them all married soldiers during the Second World War. So we have her eldest daughter here, our eldest sister, Mary, and her second eldest, Josephine. And as Rita recalls, John, Mary, and Josephine all went to work in Wigan in a munitions factory. Like many of the women, they wanted to do their bit, and so they went over to England and worked in the industries there. The girls also worked in the Naffy canteen, Mary and Joe, and that's where Joe met Ian. Then Mary met an Irishman. He was in the British Army, but he was from Dublin. And she married him, Jim Gorman. So that's 2 of the sisters. The third sister was Vera. So Vera, Lily, and Philomena, they worked in the spinning mill in Tandragee, and Vera was a reeler. And before Joe went to Wigan, she went with an American, a Yank. And my granny couldn't remember her name. But Joe used to go out and meet this Yank at a dance in Tandragee, and Vera went with her. And that's where she met her husband, Arthur Tolman. She met him at a dance in Banbridge, and they were married within 3 weeks, or it was maybe 3 months. But she married him very soon afterwards, and then he was captured, captured by the Japanese. So that's a photo of them on their wedding day, and you can see him in his uniform, Arthur and Vera. Now, can anyone identify this map for me?
Belfast.
It is Belfast, very good. And is there anything strange about this map?
Airport.
So if you look at the top, Stad Plan Belfast. So this is a German map of Belfast, and this was recovered after the war. A lot of people thought that Belfast was too small, too insignificant, it wasn't going to be targeted. But as you can see for this map, the Germans were very well aware of Belfast. You can see here there's Belfast City Hall and all the main roads into the city, the train tracks, the docks, the waterworks are all marked with precision. And as I say, a lot of people didn't think that the Germans would come. Unfortunately, they came 4 times in 1941. On the first night, that was the 6th and 7th of April 1941, and it became known as the Dockside Raid. What we believe is that there was a larger raid in England, and for some reason they couldn't find their target. And so a small contingent of bombers, I believe between 6 and 8, went off and tried to hit secondary targets. And so they came to Belfast just to sort of test out the defences. Belfast wasn't very well defended at all. And on this night, it was a very clear night, and so it was a very focused raid on the docks area. They did a lot of damage, but there were very few casualties. The only people killed were in the docks area, and they were all fire watchers. Basically, people that worked in the shipyard and volunteered in case there was fires or incendiaries dropped on the shipyard, they would help put them out. But they weren't particularly well trained. And one story from this raid was that there was a landmine that dropped onto the docks, and all the local fire watchers saw them coming in, and they thought it was a paratrooper. And so they rushed in to seize this paratrooper, and of course, when it hit the ground, and they were all unfortunately killed. So then people thought, well, Belfast has had its bit. It was a very small raid. There was nothing to worry about. However, 2 weeks later, on the 16th of April, Easter Tuesday raid, they had the largest raid that happened in Belfast. On that night, there was a smoke screen set up over the docks, and it was also very low cloud cover. So the pathfinders marked up the docks and hit North Belfast, which is obviously all residential. And this explains the really high casualty rates. It's believed just under 750 people were killed in a single night. And to put that into perspective, a lot of people, when they talk about the Blitz, they think about London, they think about Coventry. But in terms of casualties, Belfast is only beaten by London and Liverpool for a single raid because it was just so deadly. And so many people didn't think it was going to happen. And there wasn't enough air raid shelters for about 50%. There was only enough for about 50% of the population. And there weren't very many anti-aircraft guns. And there were no Spitfires in the air. This man is Billy McMillan, and he grew up here on Ravenscroft Avenue. So he's going to talk a bit about his memories of the Blitz, and I'm going to show some photos that the Belfast Telegraph took at the time.
I remember on the night of the big raid, we stood at the front of the house, for at that time a lot of people left the Newton Orange Road and went up towards Orangefield to get away from the city. And we'll come, must have been at least 10 o'clock. I can still remember my father saying, "Come on, let's go to bed for there's not going to be anything tonight." But a short time after, it was, what would you say, in hell let loose. Well, first of all, we spent a good while up below the stairs, but there was a bomb fell just across the street from us, and that took our house to bits, brought the whole lot in round us, and we got out then and got in near each other. Awful. People just jammed into the top of one another. They were very dangerous anyway. For if a bomb was close, the walls blew out, the roof just fell. A couple of people just killed them.
So as I said, there wasn't enough air raid shelters for the people of Belfast. But as Billy remembers, they weren't particularly safe. And there were a couple of incidents, and there was the Atlantic Avenue shelter. So a landmine fell nearby, and the walls, which were only sort of 1 brick thick, gave out, and the concrete roof collapsed and killed a lot of people inside. Also, Percy Street, that suffered a direct hit, very similar circumstances, and basically the whole street was wiped out. And you can understand from those images why whole streets, if an air raid shelter was hit, everybody in that street that was in that air raid shelter, they're gone. So whole families were all killed together. And to put that, I said Billy obviously grew up in Ravenscroft Avenue, and he remembers a bomb falling quite nearby, and they decided to leave the house and go to the air raid shelter. So that's the air raid shelter, and there's the crater from a landmine. You can see how close he came to actually being killed and wiped out with the entire street. So after Easter Tuesday, which was obviously completely devastating to the city, over 50% of the housing stock was damaged and rendered unlivable, so people obviously had to get out of the city. There were two small raids in May, the 4th and 5th of May, which became known as the fire raid because there was 96,000 incendiaries dropped on Belfast in a single night. And the 5th and 6th of May raid, which is known as the final raid, there was very small raid in comparison. So the 4th and 5th raid, the fire raid, was really focused on the historic centre of Belfast, so sort of Waring Street, High Street. And this is a photo of Bridge Street. So if you can imagine this here, this is Arnott's department store, which is now the post office on the corner of Bridge Street and High Street. So Bridge Street was just completely wiped out. And really the only building that was left standing was the Northern Wig on the corner, which was just a shell because it had been burnt out. Got better. There you can see the smouldering ruins of Bridge Street. There's Arnott's there. Just the whole street's gone, and there's the Albert clock still standing, and there's firemen putting out some fires still. So this was the morning after the raid. And Bridge Street became known as Blitz Square because it was so badly damaged, and it was just cleared. After the war, in later years of the war, they used to put have sort of fundraising appeals for the war effort. So I think at one point they had a Spitfire there, and people would donate to try and get Belfast a Spitfire. But as I say, it was completely devastating. Although there were no bombs fell in County Armagh that we know of, it obviously still would have affected people. And this is Derek Walker. He grew up in Portadown, and he remembers the night of the raids in being the air raid time going, and they have to go to the air raid shelter in Portadown.
The first of those raids, for the very first time, we used an air raid shelter that my grandfather had constructed to serve 4 houses in the road where we lived in Hanover Street. And I was wakened by the sound of the siren and dressed and taken downstairs, and there were a dozen or more people sitting in the air raid shelter on benches and wondering what might happen. Of course, nothing did happen. Any aircraft passed over on their way to Belfast where the terrible bombing took place. And I suppose people felt relieved that at least we had been included in that. The second occasion, on the second big blitz on Belfast, we were joined in the air raid shelter by 2 women who had lost their home in the first Belfast bombing. And I think that was the first time when I saw grown-up people really looking terrified. And they came into the shelter and they were, recalling the experiences that they must have had in the first raid in Belfast. And once again, nothing happened in Portadown. We were all glad to hear the notes of the all clear sounding and went back to bed. But of course, there had been more terrible damage, which we heard about next day in Belfast.
Obviously, when these blitzes were occurring, people were in air raid shelters, but they were also witnessing the Belfast Blitz. So at any high point around the city, I've heard people being taken out by their parents usually and taken to a high point like a hill. And from that vantage point, from Portadown, Randallstown, all those sort of surrounding towns, even though they were quite far away, they could see the sky lit up. And the same way, I suppose, you can see with light pollution today, and they could see the light of the fires and the bombing lighting up the sky. In fact, it's reported that it could even be seen as far away as Liverpool. Such was the intensity of the fire for the fire raid. Obviously, as well, Northern Ireland is a small place, and so everybody knew somebody in Belfast. This is Jean Edwards, and she grew up in Milford, so not very far from where we are now. And she remembers how her mother was really terribly worried the next day after the raid because she was waiting to hear from her sister.
I remember Belfast Blitz, and the next day, my mother was unsettled. She kept walking. We lived in the Belfast and I could see up the village street. And she kept walking out to the corner street up the village street to see was there any sign of Aunt Ella and Delaney working the business, was any sign of her away. And there was no sign of her all day. And then my father came home from work. She said, "Oh, I've been unsettled all day. I haven't done anything. Could we just go and visit? We went and visited my father's sister. Just wanted somebody to talk to, really. Christmas, get away from it all. And while we were there, now this is a small farm about a mile further up from Milford. And while we were there, my cousin arrived to say that Aunt Ella had arrived in Armagh. We weren't in, but that she'd gone to their house and she was with them in Hill Street in Belfast. So of course we all go down to my aunt's in Hill Street, and they had got the newspaper. My mother was reading the Belfast Telegram and must have been a list of casualties in it, and she discovered that her aunt had been killed in the Blitz. That's the answer. Yeah, she had been killed in the Blitz. And that's how we found out that we were in my other aunt. We were all together. And I remember Aunt Ella, the baby was with us, and she was really still distressed and had she had sat actually in a cold hole, which is really just up to the stairs all night, and had cancer. She wouldn't have it in her hand because the pressure of her fingers was on knuckles, was on her forehead, where she'd been holding her head all night.
You can imagine how worried Jean's family and Jean's mother would have been, worried about her sister, and then relieved when her sister eventually made her way to Armagh, but then devastated that their elderly aunt had been killed in the raids. And I mean, for across the 4 blitzes, we have a number of 952 people that were killed. And when you think about, everybody knows someone that was killed in the Troubles, and that was 3,000 dead or so over a 30-year period. This is a third of that in 4 nights in April and May 1941. So you can imagine the effect that would have had on the community. And as I say, much like Jean's aunt who came to Milford, people wanted to get out of Belfast. There had been government evacuation schemes in 1940, but they were really unpopular. As I say, people didn't think Belfast was going to be blitzed, so why would they send away their children? And we have reports of people coming over from England, soldiers and people visiting, and they were absolutely horrified that there were so many children in Belfast, and they were going to the police stations and asking why they weren't being evacuated. Many preferred to stay at home rather than go into the air raid shelters, which people saw as dirty, and so they would hide under the stairs or in Morrison shelters, sort of tables which were reinforced metal tables, and that they would shelter under. Or they would go get the train out into the local town surrounding Belfast, or they would just simply walk up the roads into the hills, and they would sleep in the ditches because they were so afraid of the Blitz. After the Blitz, as I said, 50% of the houses were damaged, and so people didn't have a choice. They had to leave Belfast. They couldn't find anywhere else to stay. And so there were a lot of private evacuations afterwards. People just went to family in the countryside, or they would rely on the kindness of strangers. And we've got stories of people going and just being put up in barns or in sort of hen houses and things because they were so desperate for any sort of shelter. These are some photos of the Belfast Telegraph took of evacuees leaving the GNR station, or Great Victoria Street, or Grand Central as it is now. This is Elizabeth McIver, and she was sent to Armagh with her younger siblings.
I was only 3 and a half actually when I went to Armagh with my whole family, 4 of us, because during the war my daddy had to work in the shipyard and my mother was staying there, but she came with us and had to go home to have the children as they were 4. So at 3 and a half, my mum died, and we were left in Armagh then when other people might have been coming home to help my father. This lady, Mrs. Squire, who we were with, kept us on. So she kept us on until the war was over. came back. We started school in Armagh, in a mixed school, and there was only 2 bedrooms in it. And we remember, one thing I do remember was that during the religious instruction, we had to go out as Protestants to the playground and in our GP knickers, navy knickers, and do PE while the other people helped them down the religious instruction, which made us different as opposed to not knowing a difference when we went down there. But I do remember that. And we were happy, which was a nice lady, and we went church going. She was a choir master, played the organ in church. And I also remember that she lived with just like one room, a kitchen. We spent most of her time in the kitchen and the garden. She had apple orchards, and she sold the apples to the pickers when they come down to take them back to Belfast to help her to make her living.
And the people you were staying with in Armagh, did your family know them?
No, we didn't. Nobody knew. There was arranged by a granted at that time by the government. And I only know that my father always said he didn't want to separate it, and he found it very difficult for somebody to take 4 children. But he did get Mrs. Squire to take the 4 of us, and we were never separated. Only when my mum died, Don came down and took my eldest brother home to keep him company and left the 2 girls and the new baby, the other people.
So although Elizabeth lost her mother and when she was giving birth to the youngest baby, she had that, because she was evacuated and because they were relying on the kindness of Mrs. Squire, she had a really positive war away from Belfast. She had a really positive evacuation experience. And a lot of the people we interviewed did have a positive evacuation experience. It was a bit of a culture shock to them coming from Belfast, coming out to the countryside. A lot of people commented they didn't realise that milk came from a cow rather than a glass bottle. But a lot of people we've interviewed, for instance, I remember Baroness Eileen Paisley, when I interviewed her, she said that when she first got to the country, used to make fun of her because she sounded different. She sounded like she was from Belfast. Then 3 years later, when she went back to Belfast, all the locals made fun of her because she sounded like she was from the country. But some people didn't have a positive evacuation experience, such as Patsy. So Patsy was evacuated to Portadown, and she did have a really nice time. The first people she was evacuated to.
Allocated to go to Portadown, and I'm sure and certain, I was feeling very nervous being a 5-year-old, and I was a wee country girl. I went to a house first of all in Portadown. It was a terrace house, and their son was in the RAF, and they sent me to bed because they only had the one son and the other bedroom I got, but they weren't very good to me. It was bad enough, Michael, having to leave my mum and dad, and being an only child. I had the best mum in the world, and it was very, very hard to leave and go to strangers you didn't know. So anyway, I was met at the station, and then I had a wee case with my wee groceries and my clothes in it, and my badge to say Patricia Moore, and I suppose a number, and then I had my gas mask hanging around the shoulder. So when they took me to this house, these were an older couple. I didn't like it at all. I broke my heart in that house. My mama used to come down the odd weekend, and she used to bring me down. She used to let me lovely dresses, clothes and all, and bring me sweets and all down. And they used to take it off me and give it to their friends. And they weren't very good because I went to bed with them and I couldn't talk. But I hadn't much going for me.
And although Patsy was 5 years old, it was the trauma of the Blitz, and that she actually sort of regressed and she stopped speaking and she started wetting the bed and things like that. And when she was sent to Portadown, obviously they looked at her as a 5-year-old and thought, well, you should be a bit older, you should be talking. And they didn't treat her very well. As they said, they used to take her sweets off her and give them to their friends. But afterwards, thankfully, they were she was sent then to a farm outside Portadown, and she had a really positive experience there because there was another little evacuee boy, and she said that was just like a wee brother to her, and they had a really happy experience. So for the most part, evacuation was a good thing, and a lot of people have those positive experiences, but there are rare examples where kids obviously didn't have a good time. Obviously, as well, Northern Ireland played host to a range of people, evacuees by another name, from Europe. This is one such man, George Bloch. He was originally he was from Danzig, but at the start of the war, he was in Warsaw because they'd been expelled by the Nazis. His father was working in Northern Ireland trying to set up a factory, which became Ulster Laces Limited. And he got that set up and sent for his family, who left Poland basically the day before war was declared.
Dad came to England quite regularly. He came over in May in 1939 to get the factory sort of getting started and all the work that was required at the time. And as I mentioned, it started off in 16 Edward Street in rented premises in 1939. And it ended up with a very nice modern factory in Portadown on the local road, employing 750 people.
And what was the name of the business?
That's the Laces Limited.
You and your mother and brother were in Poland, and your father arranged for you to come to Northern Ireland.
That's correct.
You arrived in September 1939.
39, we actually arrived in Dover on the 1st of September and crossed over from Liverpool to Belfast on 3rd of September.
And you managed to get the last train out of Poland?
That's correct. I reckon I won the lottery at the age of 11. I mean, look, if we hadn't been on the train, we didn't stand a chance of surviving. The rest of the family didn't. And, the tragedy of the whole thing is that you don't even know where they were taken and how it all happened. It's pretty rough. Personally, I've been asked a number of times whether I've been back to Eastern Europe, to Danzig, or to Poland, or any part of that world, and I have never gone back. And people said, well, would you not like to relive, your youth there? And my analogy is, if you grew up in Ireland as a youngster, and then moved to a different part of the world at the age of 11, and something very tragic happened to all your friends and family who lived in Ulster and Ireland, and were no longer there, and you knew why they were no longer there, would you really want to go back? Maybe it's cowardly. I don't know, but I just couldn't face up to it.
You can imagine, obviously, an evacuee being sent from Belfast to the countryside, and them struggling with the accent being different. But for George, who was 11 years old, coming from Poland, not speaking any English, and being landed in Portadown, what a culture shock that would have been for him and his family. Obviously, George wasn't the only visitor to Northern Ireland during the Second World War, and a lot of people remember the GIs arriving after Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, a day that will live in infamy. The Americans swiftly entered the war. They had already been here. They'd been building places like Langford Lodge and different air bases across Northern Ireland. But they officially arrived in January 1942. And Northern Ireland, Belfast, was the first place that an American entered the European theatre of war. And that man was this man here, Private Milburn Henke. So he was the first official American GI to set foot in Europe. And he was chosen because he was quite handsome and he was a bit of a poster boy. Later in the war, he tried to join the US Rangers, which obviously was formed in Carrickfergus, but he was turned down because it was seen that if he was injured or killed, it would be too much of a hit to morale. But he was very popular. In fact, he had to go on the radio and assure his American fiancée that his eye hadn't been turned by any of the Irish colleagues. But he was the first of over 300,000 Americans that passed through Northern Ireland. And to put that into perspective, in December 1943, Americans represented 10% of the population. So you can just imagine every single town, every single village, these Americans who people have described them as sort of aliens landing from outer space, just arriving in the town, and people not knowing what to make of them. All the Americans that came here were issued with a pocket guide to Northern Ireland, and it's sort of a little tourism book, and it tells them things that they can and or should do. Things like you shouldn't discuss politics or religion with an Irishman, that they'll drink more tea than they will for the rest of their lives in a single day, to watch out for poaching, it's dynamite, and also that the women aren't necessarily flirting with them, they're just particularly friendly. But some of those women were flirting with them. And Americans were very popular. They were better paid, they were better looking, and they were better off. And they had better uniforms, as people usually say. And obviously they were a bit exotic compared to the local men. So a lot of women were attracted to them. As well as that, Americans would have had access to goods and they would have been encouraged to give out those goods. So they would have had sweets which they were encouraged to give kids. Local kids were encouraged to go up to them and say, "Got any gum, chum?" And they would get some chewing gum. And this was, for a lot of people, the first introduction to a lot of American foods like chewing gum, Coca-Cola, peanut butter, and things like that. But the girls got things off them as well, such as nylon stockings. That was the big one. And there were a lot of GI brides. So this is Papa Jake Larson. So he landed in January 1942 in Northern Ireland, and he was stationed in Brownlow House in Lurgan. Papa Jake died just a couple of months ago, but actually in 2022 he came back to Northern Ireland for the first time in 80 years. He came back and he visited us in the museum and we interviewed him. And this is his sort of recollections of coming to Northern Ireland. Can you tell me a bit about when you came to Northern Ireland then? What did you think of it?
Oh, it was freedom. You guys are right on level with the United States as far as the way you think. And I like that. We were walking down streets of Lurgan there, and we heard music on a Saturday night. Dance music. Saxophone led all the dance music. And we followed the music and finally found an outdoor upstairs stairway, completely everything blacked out. You can't imagine what it's like to walk around and just feel for things. Mm-hmm. And we went up those stairs and opened another door in, and man, there we stood, aghast. There were people dancing up there. And man, I just loved to dance. So I was standing there, just a goggle, and this young lady came up to me, and she says, "Welcome, did you come up to dance?" I says, I didn't even know there was a dance on. I says, "But I love to dance." Well, she says, "My name is Nan, Nan, Moody, Moody. And she says, "I'll dance with you." So we would always meet at the dance floor. We never took her home or anything, but we'd dance. And every Saturday night we'd come up there to the dance.
Top there, that's a photo of Jake in 1942 in the grounds of Brownlow House in a Jeep, and then that's him with some of his friends at Brownlow House again. As I say, the Americans were quite popular, and there were a number of local ladies who married GIs. So there's an estimated 1,800 GI brides. Now, I've got a list that I'm working on, and I've got about 1,400 names, so I'm on the way, but I'm not quite there yet. But this is a selection. From my list, I've got 69 from County Armagh, and this is some photographs. So this is Margaret Greta Badole of 90 Hill Street, Lurgan. She married Sergeant Paul Fetters of Montpelier, Ohio. Ellen Halliday of 11 College Square, Bestbrook, married Staff Sergeant Leon Earl Lindgren of Pasadena, California. Maureen Donnelly of 106 Railway Street, Armagh, and Private Artie Mudge of New Jersey. And then Lillian Wilkinson of Portadown married Corporal Ermin Buxton of Driggs, Idaho. So I plotted these GI brides on a map. So you can see there's County Armagh. There's a couple that cut off, but I had to make it so we could make them out. And they're all concentrated sort of in Armagh, Portadown, and Lurgan. So you can see Armagh, they're all sort of spread out across the city, and then Lurgan's the same. And you can understand why the bigger population areas would have more American stations, particularly Lurgan, which had Brownlow House, and Kirkcassock House, which were sort of centres for American servicemen. But of those 69 ladies or GI brides, this is them in America. You can see that they're all across the United States. I think it was 23 different states out of the 50 that they represented. And a lot of them obviously went on and had families, had very positive lives. Some of them came home, some of them had divorces or weren't very happy and came home. Some of them got out there and realised that maybe their American who had a lot of money had sort of inflated his own personal background, and then they were taken out to the middle of Colorado and they didn't know anybody, and they didn't have a good time and they came home. But one such lady who had a positive experience was Richard Large and Ivy Rowlands. So Ivy was from Lurgan, and a couple of years ago, their daughter wrote up their stories. So I'll read out to you. Richard, dad, was stationed at Brownlow House in Lurgan from October 43 until February 44. Ivy, mom, worked in the laundry department of Mercer and Brown on Union Street in Lurgan, and that was where the US troops got their laundry washed and ironed. Dad was one of the soldiers who brought the laundry each week. One day he walked in and mom was there. There was another woman working with her. Dad's opening line was, "Hi Shorty, where do you live?" To which the woman with mom replied, "In a house." I guess he didn't like Dad's opening line, but to be fair, mother was not a small woman. Then again, at 5 feet 9 inches, Dad was not tall either. Dad would take the laundry to where mum worked often. He was smitten immediately, and they started dating December 31st, 1943. They attended dances, and mum showed him around Lurgan and the neighbouring areas. When Dad left Lurgan for England and other countries, he and mum missed each other very much. Dad wrote home to his parents and siblings about the very special wee Irish woman he met. He was head over heels by that time. Eventually, mom started writing to Dad's mother, and she sent her some Irish linen handkerchiefs. Dad's mother sent over stockings over for Dad to get to mom. Dad also tried to send mom a little money here and there so she'd get things she needed. Additionally, he would send home cigarettes for my granddad. From what I understand, Dad got a furlough, came to Lurgan, proposed to mom, and they were wed 2 days later. So mom bought her dress in Lurgan with 2 days' notice, and that is then on their wedding day. Alongside this story, their daughter actually kindly donated a number of items relating to their parents' story. So she did lots and lots of photographs that they have of the time when their parents were dating in Lurgan, and some photos that the father took when he was sent over to Germany, articles and letters that they would send back and forth to each other. All the letters started "Dearest Darling," and that's dated the 31st of May, 1944. And so they would correspond like that for over 2 years until he managed to get back to be able to marry his sweetheart. She also donated her father's medical kit, which was complete. You can see the needles and scalpels and everything there, and some currency that he picked up while in the war, his dog tags, his medals, and then on the mum's side, she donated this photograph of obviously their wedding and her mother's wedding dress and hat, which she bought with 2 days' notice in Lurgan. So we're really privileged to have that sort of collection and the story to go alongside it and within the war memorial. And that sort of emphasizes, although I collect stories by interviewing people, every object has its own story, and that's the sort of thing that we want to bring out and tell to people. So to finish off, victory, VE Day, 8th of May 1945, and VJ Day, the 15th of August 1945. Obviously, we've just had a big anniversary for VE Day 80, and there was lots of celebrations going on across the summer. But how was VE and VJ Day celebrated in Armagh? So there were bonfires, there were parades, there were street parties, there were dances, and they were up and down the country. And these are some local headlines that were in the Armagh Guardian. So jollification at Guildford and Tandragee, VE Day in Lurgan, scenes of unbounded enthusiasm as Portadown celebrates VE Day. And the articles would go on to describe the happenings, because you can imagine after nearly 6 years of war, people were just so relieved that the war was over. So Portadown, Jean Edwards first in Milford. So she remembers.
I remember the end of the war. I was at Armagh Girls High School at this time. The headmistress at assembly saying, picking the hymn, and the hymn was "Now Thank We All Our God." I remember that. Suppose we prayed, we sang that hymn, "Now Thank We All Our God," at the assembly as war was over. I do remember that. And I also remember in front of the courthouse in Armagh, there was an outdoor dance to celebrate the end of the war. And of course, I'm sure my father listened to church at King or wherever we were making a broadcast.
And did you go to the dance outside the courthouse?
Yes, I remember going, people gathered together. It was a celebration, we were all there.
And then in Portadown, so I showed you a photo of my grandmother earlier, and to make the balance, this is my grandfather, her husband, and he grew up in Portadown, and he remembers vividly VE Day and getting in a bit of trouble.
The rejoicings up the town, everybody was out on the town, in the middle of Portadown. We were all out in the middle of the town, the music and all was going. And we belonged to an organisation at that time called the YCW, Young Christian Workers. We belonged to them. And there was a choir squad of us suspended for being into kissing rings.
So everybody was out celebrating?
Oh!
And you were kissing a few girls and you were suspended?
Doing a bit of jigging and kissing.
That was tough, wasn't it? And had somebody seen you?
Weren't that right about a few sneaky boys had been watching. You were named, that's it. No, you didn't. The boys I remember, we didn't care about the YCW.
No.
Oh, it was great. The whole town was lightened up.
Obviously, VE Day was celebrated beyond County Armagh, and that's a photo of Portadown on VE Day. You can see that's the High Street, and just the crowds and the flags and the bunting. It's been a great celebration. So obviously, County Armagh wasn't exclusive to VE Day celebrations. This is Barbara or Barry Adair, and she went down to City Hall. Like a lot of people in Belfast, they all flocked and congregated to City Hall. So I'm going to let her sort of tell her memories, but I'll also show a bit of footage that the War Memorial are very lucky to have. So this was given to us in 2020. It was found in a biscuit tin in the attic of a man who grandfather had recorded. He found the recorder and the footage, and we got it digitised. It sort of shows all the scenes around City Hall. So you'll see City Hall, Robinson, Cleaver, Royal Avenue. So Barry will tell her story, and I'll play the footage.
But on VE Day, which was the day after, two of my girlfriends who were a year older than me picked me up, and we all went into town, and we walked up and down from the junction to the City Hall. It was jammed full of people, and we walked up and down all evening. I think we went out after tea. And eventually I got a bit worried because I was supposed to be home by 10 o'clock at least at this time. And the other two girls wouldn't come home. And there were no buses. And of course, even if there had been taxis, I had no money. So I walked home. all by myself in the dark. Well, it wasn't all that dark because it was June, but and I was fine until I nearly got to the arches, and some drunk old man spoke to me and turned and followed me as I walked on. And I turned round and shouted at him, "Go away," and walked on, and a young soldier came up and he says, "You're all right, miss. I won't walk beside you. I'll walk on the outside of the pavement, but I'll stop anybody coming." He was walking out to wherever I told you that place was.
Mm-hmm.
And we got up as far as our gate, and my father was leaning over the gate, and he was into the soldier like, of course he got it wrong. By that time I was chatting away to the soldier, you know. I mean, I was nearly 15.
Mm.
And he said, "Daddy, this soldier came along to help me because I was a horrible old drunk man, so there was." It must have been 12 o'clock. I mean, they were demented, worrying about me, but they didn't know what to do about it, you know. That sort of spoiled VE Day for me.
We're really lucky, obviously, to have that footage of VE Day in Belfast, and you can see the crowd yourself. I've never seen City Hall as busy as it was probably on that day. So I hope I've given you a bit of an insight into what the Second World War was like for the people in County Armagh and through their war histories. If you or anyone you know has memories of the Second World War, I've got a leaflet on all the chairs, so feel free to pass on my contact information, because we're still collecting those memories while we still can. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.